The gavel of silence fell over the 23rd floor boardroom. The moment I walked in wearing the same gray cardigan I always wore to Sunday dinner, the one my son-in-law used to joke made me look like a retired mailman. 12 executives sat frozen around the mahogany table, and at the head of it sat Ethan Cole, 34 years old, sharp navy suit, gold watch he'd bought, with a bonus he didn't earn honestly, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost rise out of his own paycheck. "Robert," he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard in 9 years of family dinners. "What are you doing here?" I set my leather folder on the table, the one containing 11 months of research, bank records, shell company filings, and sworn statements, and I said the sentence I had waited 3 years to say out loud. "I'm doing what I should have done the day you humiliated my daughter at Thanksgiving in front of my grandchildren. I'm firing you from the company I built before you were old enough to shave." The room didn't breathe. Ethan's hand trembled around his coffee cup. And to understand how a quiet, unassuming 61-year-old man ended up standing in that boardroom holding the fate of his own son-in-law in his hands, you have to go back to a rainy October evening 11 years earlier, back before any of them knew who I really was. My name is Robert Whitfield, and for most of my adult life, I preferred to be underestimated. I grew up in a small town outside Pittsburgh where my father worked the steel mills until his lungs gave out, and my mother cleaned office buildings at night to keep the lights on. I learned early that the loudest man in the room is rarely the smartest one, and that money talks best when it whispers. I started my first company, a modest logistics software firm, out of a 2-bedroom apartment when I was 26, and through 18 years of unglamorous, patient work, I built it into something that eventually caught the attention of a much larger conglomerate. I sold it for an amount that changed my family's life forever, but I never changed the way I dressed, the car I drove, or the way I introduced myself to strangers. To most people who met me at the grocery store or the community garden where I volunteered on weekends, I was simply Robert, a widower who liked woodworking and doted on his only daughter, Claire. Very few people outside my lawyers and a handful of trusted partners knew that I had quietly used the proceeds from that sale to acquire a controlling stake in Meridian Dynamics, a mid-sized data infrastructure company that over the following decade I helped grow into a billion-dollar enterprise, all while remaining listed publicly only as a silent majority shareholder through a holding company that bore my late wife's maiden name instead of mine. Claire was 24 when she brought Ethan home for the first time. He was charming in the way that ambitious young men often are, quick with a compliment, quicker with a handshake, always angling the conversation toward what he called the bigger picture. He had just graduated with an MBA and was starting as a junior analyst at a company he described, almost breathlessly, as the fastest-growing tech infrastructure firm on the East Coast. I remember sitting across from him at my kitchen table, watching him talk about his 5-year plan to make VP, then director. Then eventually he said with a laugh that was only half a joke, "Run the whole show." I remember smiling and asking him gently what he thought made a good leader, and he told me without hesitation that a good leader never let sentiment get in the way of results, that loyalty was a tool, not a virtue, and that the people who rose fastest were the ones willing to do what others wouldn't. I filed that answer away in the back of my mind the way I filed away every piece of information that mattered, and I said nothing except that it was an interesting philosophy. For the first few years, Ethan was, by all outward appearances, a devoted husband. He and Claire married in a small ceremony by the lake where she used to fish with her late mother, and I walked her down the aisle with a lump in my throat and a quiet hope that this young man would learn over time to temper his ambition with kindness. Claire gave birth to our first grandchild, a bright, curious girl named Lily, and 2 years later, a son named Theo. I watched Ethan climb the ranks at Meridian Dynamics with genuine speed, not because he was undeserving of credit, since he was, in fact, intelligent and hardworking in his own calculating way, but because he had a talent for making himself visible to the right people at the right moments, while quietly taking credit for the work of people who couldn't defend themselves. I heard whispers of this from old colleagues who still checked in with me, men who had no idea I owned the company through 3 layers of holding structures, men who simply knew me as the old software guy from Pittsburgh, who occasionally asked polite questions about how the business was doing. What I heard concerned me, but I told myself that ambition wasn't a crime and that perhaps fatherhood would soften him. It didn't. If anything, the arrival of his children seemed to sharpen the edges I had first noticed at my kitchen table. Claire began calling me more often, always careful to frame her worries as small annoyances rather than real problems, the way a daughter does when she doesn't want her father to think less of the man she chose. "Ethan works too much," she'd say. "Ethan gets irritated when the kids interrupt his calls. Ethan says we need to economize even though I know we don't need to." I noticed she'd stopped wearing the sapphire earrings I'd given her for her 30th birthday, and when I asked about it, she said quietly that Ethan thought they looked ostentatious for a man in his position, as though her jewelry reflected on his professional image rather than being a gift from her father. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself don't matter until you realize they were never small at all, only the early tremors of something much larger. The moment that changed everything happened 3 Thanksgivings ago, in my own dining room, at a table I had built with my own hands the year Claire was born. Ethan had just been promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations, and he wore that promotion like a crown the entire evening, correcting people's grammar, interrupting Claire mid-sentence to add context to her stories. And at one point, when 6-year-old Lily accidentally spilled cranberry sauce on his sleeve, he snapped at her so sharply that she burst into tears and had to be carried upstairs by her mother. When Claire came back down, eyes red, and gently asked him to apologize to their daughter, Ethan looked around the table at my brother, my nephew, and 2 old friends of mine and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "This is exactly the problem with this family. Everyone's so soft. No wonder Claire married someone who actually knows how to build something instead of just talking about it." He looked directly at me when he said it. I remember the silence that followed, the way my brother's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, the way Claire's hands trembled in her lap. I remember standing up slowly, walking to the kitchen, and getting Lily a fresh piece of pie, saying nothing to Ethan at all. But that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my study until 3 in the morning, and I made a decision. I decided that a man who would humiliate his wife and child in front of family to stroke his own ego at a dinner table was not a man I could simply hope would change. I decided it was time to finally learn, with complete certainty and complete documentation, exactly who my son-in-law really was. I want to be clear that what followed was not born from spite. I have never believed in petty revenge, in slashed tires or screaming matches or airing family business on social media for strangers to feast on. I believed, as I always had in business, that the most powerful weapon a patient man could wield was the truth, fully documented, fully verified, and delivered at precisely the right moment. So I began, quietly, to pay closer attention to Meridian Dynamics, the company I had controlled from a careful distance for over a decade, the company where my own son-in-law now sat 2 levels below the CEO, utterly unaware that the man who occasionally showed up to shareholder meetings introduced only as R. Whitfield, representing Ashcombe Holdings, was his wife's father. I had structured my ownership that way for reasons that had nothing to do with Ethan originally. I simply preferred, after selling my first company and watching how differently people treated me once they learned I had money, to keep my involvement in Meridian quiet so that the people working there would deal with each other honestly, not performatively for my benefit. It was only after that Thanksgiving that this quiet arrangement became something else entirely, an opportunity. Over the following 18 months, I asked my longtime attorney, a sharp, discreet woman named Patricia Nwosu, who had handled my affairs for over a decade, to conduct a thorough but entirely lawful review of Ethan's conduct within the company. I want to be honest that I did not go looking for a crime to invent. I went looking for the truth, whatever it turned out to be, prepared for the possibility that Ethan was simply an unpleasant man at home, but a competent, honest professional at work, in which case I would have had to reckon with the more painful reality that Claire had simply married someone incompatible with kindness, a problem money and documentation could never solve. But the truth, once it began to surface, was far more troubling than I expected. Patricia's team, working alongside a forensic accountant I trusted completely, discovered that Ethan had, over the previous 2 years, been quietly steering a significant portion of Meridian's vendor contracts toward a logistics consulting firm called Bredgeline Partners, a firm that, on paper, appeared to be an independent third party, but was, in fact, secretly co-owned by Ethan through a shell entity registered under his college roommate's name. The markups on these contracts were subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion, a few percentage points here, a slightly inflated hourly rate there. But over 2 years, they had quietly siphoned nearly $4 million away from the company in overpayments that funneled, eventually, back into Ethan's personal investment accounts. I remember sitting in Patricia's office the day she showed me the full financial trail, feeling a strange, hollow kind of grief rather than anger. The grief of realizing that the man raising my grandchildren was capable of this kind of calculated, sustained deception. But even that discovery, damning as it was not the final piece. Patricia's investigation also turned up something I had not anticipated at all. A pattern of increasingly frequent late-night meetings between Ethan and a junior marketing director named Vanessa Ruiz. Meetings that, according to hotel records obtained through entirely legal means during the corporate fraud investigation, had taken place in 3 different cities over the past year, always coinciding with business trips Ethan had told Claire were solo obligations. I did not tell Claire immediately. I have thought long and hard, in the years since, about whether that was the right choice, and I still believe it was, because I understood that this was not information our father should deliver secondhand, through suspicion or gossip. It needed to come with proof so undeniable that Claire would never have to wonder for even a moment whether she had done something to deserve it, and it needed to come at a moment of my choosing, not a moment forced upon me by Ethan's carelessness. What I did next required more patience than almost anything I had done in my professional life. I did not confront Ethan. I did not send an anonymous tip to the board. Instead, I quietly began coordinating with 2 people, Patricia, who continued building an airtight legal case, and Marcus Webb, Meridian's chief financial officer, a man I had personally recruited 8 years earlier and who had no idea of my relationship to Ethan at all, only that R. Whitfield of Ashcombe Holdings had asked him, in his capacity as a major shareholder, to conduct a standard internal audit of vendor relationships across the operations division. Marcus, thorough and unaware of any personal stakes, delivered his own independent findings 4 months later that corroborated everything Patricia's team had discovered, giving the fraud case an internal legitimacy that would be impossible for Ethan or his lawyers to dismiss as some kind of personal vendetta once it came to light. I made sure of that deliberately. I wanted no one, especially not Claire, to ever be able to say that her father had manufactured a case against her husband out of spite. I wanted the case to stand entirely on its own, so solid that even Ethan, staring at it, would recognize there was no argument left to make. During those 18 months, life at home continued its slow unraveling in ways that made the decision to proceed feel less like revenge and more like rescue. Claire called me one evening in tears, describing an argument in which Ethan had told her that her lack of ambition was embarrassing him in front of colleagues, that she should consider doing something with her degree instead of, as he put it, playing house. Claire had left a promising career in pediatric nursing when Lily was born, a decision she and Ethan had made together at the time, and hearing him weaponize that shared decision against her, twisting it into a personal failing, told me everything I needed to know about the emotional pattern I was documenting alongside the financial one. I began quietly saving these conversations too, not recordings, since I never believed in secretly taping my own daughter, but careful, dated notes in a private journal, because I understood that the fraud alone might convince a board, but it would take the full picture, financial and emotional both, to help Claire finally see clearly what she was living inside of. The final piece fell into place on a Tuesday morning in March when Marcus called me, still addressing me as Mr. Whitfield of Ashcombe Holdings, to say that the internal audit had reached a point where company policy required the findings to go before the full board, and that as a controlling shareholder, my presence would be expected. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting for a long moment in my study, looking at a photograph of Claire's wedding day, Ethan's arm around her waist, both of them smiling in a way that had felt, at the time, entirely real. I called Patricia and told her it was time. I called Marcus back and asked him for the first time to schedule the board meeting for a date I specifically requested, a Thursday, because I knew Ethan always left work early on Fridays to take the children to their swim lessons, and I wanted him to have the weekend, painful as it would be, to begin absorbing what was coming before he had to face his children again. Even in the middle of dismantling what he had built through deceit, I found myself unable to stop protecting Lily and Theo from unnecessary collateral damage. That, I think, is the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge wants everyone to suffer, while justice tries to contain the suffering to the person who earned it. 2 days before the board meeting, I finally sat down with Claire. I did not tell her everything at once. I started gently over coffee at my kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had once told me loyalty was a tool rather than a virtue, and I asked her directly whether she had been happy in her marriage for the past 2 years. She broke down almost immediately, telling me things she had never said out loud before, that she often felt like a prop in Ethan's life rather than a partner, that she suspected, though she had no proof, that something had shifted in him, some coldness she couldn't name. I held her hand and told her that I needed to share some things with her, things that would be difficult to hear, but that she deserved to know before anyone else in the world did. I showed her the financial documents first, watching her face shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet devastation as she understood the scale of what her husband had been doing while telling her they needed to economize. Then, as gently as I possibly could, I told her about the hotel records, about Vanessa Ruiz, about the trips he had claimed were solo obligations. I will never forget the sound Claire made, not a scream, not even really a sob, but a long, shuddering exhale, as though something she had suspected for a long time but refused to name had finally been given permission to exist. She asked me, through tears, how long I had known, and I told her the truth, that I had suspected something was deeply wrong since that Thanksgiving 3 years earlier, and that I had spent the following months making absolutely certain before I ever brought it to her, because I refused to destroy her trust in her marriage over anything less than complete, undeniable fact. What Claire did next surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have, because she had always been stronger than either of us gave her credit for. She wiped her face, sat up straight, and asked to see the board meeting date. When I told her Thursday, she said she wanted to be there. Not hiding, not confronting Ethan in some emotional outburst, but sitting quietly in the room as a shareholder herself, since I had, years earlier, transferred a modest but real percentage of Ashcombe Holdings voting shares into a trust in her name, a fact Ethan had never known because Claire herself had never fully understood the extent of it until that very week. I want to be honest that some part of me hesitated, worried about the emotional toll of watching her husband's downfall unfold in real time, but Claire looked at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, The same look she'd had the day she insisted on learning to ride her bicycle without training wheels, despite 2 bruised knees. And she said, "I need to see this happen with my own eyes, Dad. I need to know it's real." I could not argue with that. I had built my entire strategy around giving her undeniable truth, and denying her the chance to witness the consequence of that truth firsthand would have contradicted everything I'd worked toward. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. I wore my gray cardigan, the same one Ethan had mocked years earlier, deliberately, because I wanted him to see, in the moment everything changed, that the man he had dismissed as unimportant was the same man who now held his career in a folder on the table. Claire sat 2 seats down from me, composed, her hands folded, wearing the sapphire earrings I had given her, the ones Ethan had once called ostentatious. Marcus presented the audit findings first, methodical and unemotional, walking the board through the Bridgeline Partners contracts, the shell company registration, the markup patterns, the nearly $4 million in diverted funds. I watched Ethan's face throughout the presentation, watched the confident smirk he'd worn walking in slowly dissolve into something closer to panic as he realized this was not a routine audit but a targeted, comprehensive case built with a precision that left no room for the kind of smooth talking he'd relied on his entire career. When Marcus finished, the board chair turned to Ethan and asked if he had any response to the findings. Ethan, to his credit, tried. He argued that Bridgeline's rates were consistent with industry standards, that any relationship with the roommate was coincidental, that this smelled like a coordinated attack rather than an honest audit. It was at that exact moment, when he used the word attack, that I finally spoke, standing up from my seat at the end of the table. I introduced myself formally to the room, not as R. Whitfield of Ashcombe Holdings, but as Robert Whitfield, majority shareholder of Meridian Dynamics through Ashcombe Holdings and Ethan's father-in-law. The gasps around the table were audible. Ethan's face went the color of old paper. I told the board, calmly, that I understood the personal complexity this revelation introduced, and that I had specifically ensured, through Marcus's independent audit and Patricia's separate legal investigation, that the fraud findings stood entirely on their own merit, verifiable by anyone in the room, without a shred of reliance on my personal relationship to the man in question. I told them that I had waited until the case was airtight specifically because I refused to let anyone, especially Ethan, claim this was a father-in-law's grudge rather than a documented pattern of financial deception. Then I turned to Ethan directly, and I said the words I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head over 18 months but had never expected to feel so calm saying out loud. "You once told me at my kitchen table that loyalty was a tool, not a virtue, and that the people who rise fastest are the ones willing to do what others won't. I want you to understand something clearly. I built this company on the opposite philosophy, on the belief that trust, patience, and honest work outlast every shortcut eventually. You have spent 2 years proving my philosophy correct at your own expense." Ethan looked at Claire then, his composure finally cracking, and said her name softly, almost pleading, but Claire simply looked back at him, calm in a way I'd never seen from her before, and said, "I know about Vanessa too, Ethan. My father didn't tell me that to hurt you. He told me because I deserved to know the truth about my own life." The room went utterly silent. The board voted unanimously that same afternoon to terminate Ethan's employment for cause, which under the terms of his contract meant the forfeiture of unvested equity worth several $1,000,000. Equity he had been counting on to fund the aggressive lifestyle he and Vanessa had apparently been quietly planning together. Patricia had also prepared, in advance, a formal referral of the fraud findings to the district attorney's office, and while I want to be honest that the criminal process that followed took over a year and ultimately resulted in a plea agreement rather than a dramatic courtroom trial, Ethan was required to pay full restitution of the diverted funds, was barred from serving as an officer of any publicly connected company for a period of years, and carried the weight of that plea agreement into every future job interview he would ever sit through. There was no dramatic perp walk, no handcuffs in front of the children, because I had insisted through every step of the legal process that any resolution avoid unnecessary public spectacle that would harm Lily and Theo more than it harmed their father. Some people might call that mercy misplaced. I call it the difference between wanting justice and wanting cruelty, a difference I had thought about carefully every single night of those 18 months. Claire filed for divorce 3 weeks after that board meeting, and I want to be honest that the months that followed were not easy ones, not for her and not for the children, who were old enough to sense that something fundamental in their family had shifted even if they didn't fully understand why. But I watched my daughter, over that following year, rebuild herself in ways that filled me with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't felt since the day she graduated nursing school. She returned to pediatric nursing part-time, not out of financial necessity, since the divorce settlement and her own shares in Ashcombe Holdings ensured she would never struggle, but because she told me she wanted her children to see their mother doing work that mattered to her, work chosen freely rather than permitted grudgingly. She began therapy not because I suggested it, though I would have, but because she recognized on her own that years of being made to feel small had left marks that needed real attention rather than simple willpower. Lily, now 9, has taken up woodworking with me on weekends, insisting on building her own version of the kitchen table where all of this truth finally came to light. And Theo, 7, asks me sometimes why Daddy doesn't come to swim lessons anymore, questions I answer honestly but gently, in ways appropriate for a boy his age, always emphasizing that his father's mistakes were his own choices and never ever the fault of the children who loved him. As for Ethan, I heard through Marcus, who eventually learned the full story and remained loyal to the company rather than to old office friendships, that Ethan spent the better part of a year struggling to find work at his previous level, that Vanessa Ruiz, upon learning the full extent of the financial fallout and legal restrictions attached to his name, quietly ended things within months, and that he eventually took a much smaller operations role at a regional firm 2 states away, a long way down from the man who once stood at the head of a boardroom table, believing the world owed him whatever he was clever enough to take. I have no satisfaction in his struggle beyond the simple, quiet relief of knowing my daughter and grandchildren are finally safe from the particular kind of harm that comes from living alongside someone who mistakes cruelty for strength. I did not do any of this to destroy a man. I did it because a father who has the power to protect his family and chooses not to use it, out of fear of confrontation or discomfort or the complicated feelings of exposing someone he once welcomed into his home, is failing at the one job that matters more than any company he could ever build. People sometimes ask me, when small pieces of this story eventually surfaced among old friends and colleagues, why I waited so long, why I didn't simply confront Ethan the moment he humiliated Lily at that Thanksgiving table 3 years earlier. I tell them what I've come to believe more firmly with every passing year. That anger moves fast, but justice moves carefully, and the two should never be confused for one another. Anger would have had me shouting at Ethan across that dining room table, and he would have painted me quite convincingly as an overprotective father with no real evidence, nothing but wounded pride dressed up as concern. And Claire, still deep in the fog of a manipulative marriage, might well have taken his side out of loyalty rather than clarity. Justice required me to become quiet instead of loud, patient instead of reactive, and thorough instead of righteous, so that when the truth finally arrived, it arrived with a weight that could not be argued away, dismissed, or spun into something more sympathetic than it deserved to be. I think often about that MBA graduate sitting at my kitchen table all those years ago, telling me with such easy confidence that sentiment had no place in leadership, that loyalty was merely a tool. I think about how thoroughly, in the end, he proved himself wrong, not because I set out to prove a point, but because a man who treats every relationship as a transaction eventually finds himself surrounded by people unwilling to protect him when the transaction finally comes due. I built 2 companies in my life through patience, documentation, and quiet persistence. And it turned out that protecting my daughter required exactly the same skills, applied with exactly the same discipline, in service of something far more important than any balance sheet I have ever signed. These days, when Lily asks me why I still wear the old gray cardigan even though, as she puts it with the blunt honesty only a 9-year-old possesses, we could buy you 100 new ones, I tell her the truth, that some things are worth keeping exactly as they are, worn and unassuming and easy to underestimate, because the people who judge you by your cardigan are rarely the people paying close enough attention to see what's actually in your hands.